Good morning all. What a beautiful morning. Well, it's blue sky and the sun's out. It's 1 degree above freezing, so it's a bit chilly, but it should warm up a wee bit. And we're in Elton, and we're going to try and take on the daunting task of looking at and enjoying and hopefully explaining, at least to some degree, some of the history of Elton village. It's going to be a big one. It's going to come in 2 parts. I can't do it all in one, otherwise it'd be a very long video. The part 1, which I'm about to kick off, will be mainly at the top end of the village around Overend, albeit ironically we're going to be starting at the bottom and then sort of cutting across the fields to reach Overend. And then the second one will be dropping down into the heart of the village and sort of Middle Street and Duck Street and whatever. So yes, I say it's quite a daunting challenge, because there's a lot of history in Elton, as I'm sure you already know, and trying to understand some of it, or even most of it, is not easy. And I'm hugely indebted to the late great Alan Clark, who has written books on the subject and has helped me out immensely through his works in understanding what I'll be looking at. So we're going to kick off right down the bottom at my favourite spot in Elton, because I'm a bit of a watermill addict. We are down by the mill, so we're going to kick off at the mill and then, as I say, move across the fields and try and find our way up towards Overend. So let's crack on. Elton watermill was built in 1770 or 1770s, around about that time, and it closed in the 1930s, or stopped milling in the 1930s, or at least that's the last stage at which I could find evidence of a miller in the village. So I think 1770 to 1930 had quite a long lifespan for a watermill, because many of the other mills on the Nene had long since gone before the 1930s. So this one kept going for some time. The mad thing about it, and what makes it such a special site, is that when it did close in the 1930s, it was like the miller just locked the door, walked off, turned the lights off, and that was the end of it. All the gear, all the equipment, everything that was inside the mill is still there today. It has never been removed. And I will put some pictures up at the moment to give you a flavour of what's inside. Now, these were not taken by myself. They were taken by, I think, what's known as an urban explorer. It's probably illegal to even go in there. It's certainly dangerous to go in there, and I would not recommend anyone attempts to emulate what this chap has done. But these photographs are worth seeing, because it's pretty astonishing to think that that gear is still in the building. That equipment must be more than 100 years old, I would say. And from an industrial perspective, it must be extremely valuable. Sort of industrial heritage perspective, it must be of great value. But it's stuck in there. It was never removed. Heaven only knows how they would ever remove it if they tried now. It's just sat there, and people have said should be in a museum, blah blah blah, but it's just not feasible to move it out. It just sits there, and the mill just sits there. And although it's fantastic to see, because it's unspoilt, it's not a house, it's not a bunch of flats, it is what it was. It decays every year, and it's grade 2 listed, so it can't be knocked down by the owners, which is Elton Estates. But the cynic in me says they're just waiting for it to collapse, and they'll get rid of it that way instead. But then that gets complicated, because there's a public right of way that runs right across the front there, and if that collapses over a public right of way, you can imagine health and safety type peoples, they're going to get very jumpy. So you don't know whether this is going to last another 100 years, 50 years, another year, or it's going to collapse next week. Every year it looks worse than it did the year before, but you know, that's part of its charm. It is original, it's untouched, it's unspoilt, nobody's changed it. But the downside of that is, you know, the weather's getting in. Some of the boards have come off now, as you can see, and if the weather's getting in, it's going to rot. And if it rots, something's going to give way, and when that equipment comes tumbling down, heaven only knows what comes down with it. So it's an amazing place, love it to bits, but I hope it hangs on as long as I hang on, at the very least. On the left hand side, you can probably see a light. Well, there's a low building on the left, and The left side of the tall building is of a different brickwork colour or stonework colour to the rest of it. That's because it was added on. I think it was the 1840s. I think it was 1840. It was added on to the mill. So the mill was much smaller before that was bolted on. I think it was a bakery. I think it was added on to provide sort of bakery services. I may be wrong, but it's in my mind that I once researched it, and that's what it was. It was a sort of bolt-on bakery section, certainly the low part. And on the right, although you can't see anything, used to be the miller's house. It used to be bolted on to the side of the mill, all as one part, as part of one building, should I say. But that was demolished, I think, later in the 1800s, and the miller moved to a mill house in the village, which we'll see shortly when we depart. So it's been through a few changes, but it still stands. You can see from the lighter stonework on this end of the building, that's where the side of the miller's house was. They sort of buttressed it up to hold up the rest of the mill when they took his house down. And I'd imagine they moved it because it floods a lot here. This is a big flood area. It's much better managed now than it was in the 1800s, but this used to flood regularly, and it's no place to have a house. And I should think the miller got out pretty quickly and said, "Move me into the village, please," which they did. But you can see the windows at the top are open. Pretty sure last year they were not. They were boarded up, and certainly that one in the middle at the side was definitely boarded up last year. And as I say, once the weather gets in, it's going to shorten its life even more. This was the bolt-on section, and certainly the low part, I'm sure, was a bakery, as one might expect on the end of a mill. I think there's a plaque up above. As you can read that, but it does say AD 1840, which is when the extension was added. Right, leaving the mill site now. Plan is to get out onto Chapel Road. So called because there's a chapel on it right at the end of it, and a very nice one too. And we shall pass the miller's house, which I think is right at the entrance to this mill pass, and up Chapel Road, and somehow head over towards the church, or get lost in the fields somewhere trying to get to the church. But I did look at a map and you can get there, so I'm confident. Right, that's the miller's house with the white door across the road. A lot drier and safer than the one next to the mill, I guess. Yeah, the mill house, it says next to the door. And that is the Wesleyan Chapel. Magnificent building. Tell you a bit more about that one in a mo. That presumably is Chapel Lane. I think I called it Chapel Road, didn't I? Chapel Lane, which will be our route to the church somehow. The thing I always love about Wesleyan chapels is they put the date on the top of them and tell you what they are. I knew it was 1864 anyway. And a lovely building. It actually says re-erected at the top, and that's because prior to this one there was another Methodist chapel built in 1816 on this spot, but it was too small, and they realised that pretty quickly and thought, okay, we're not having that, and they levelled the 1816 building and built this wonderful and much bigger building instead. Lots of lovely old buildings down here. I can't tell you much about many of them because they're just not listed, and I don't know why they're not. Fireman's Cottage, I'm sure there's stories behind these names. They're just great to look at, even if I don't understand some of them. Keeper's Cottage, presumably a local gamekeeper at one time. This white one with the thatch up ahead, this definitely does date back to the 1600s. It's a listed building. Right, down the bottom end of Chapel Lane is that, which is the Manor House, dating back to 1727. There was an earlier Manor House known to date back to the 1100s, and it was believed it was underneath this one, and it was demolished and this one was built on top, which is the usual pattern of events. But there was an archaeological dig in the 1970s that actually found the original building, and it wasn't underneath the 1700s one. It was over there in the distance, through the trees near the banks of the river, and that one dates back to 1100. There's a photograph I put up here which was taken from the archaeological site from the 1970s, shooting back from the dig site right across the fields back to the 1720s Manor House. It's a lovely building. Well, we're heading up towards Elton Church now, which we will catch in a little bit. I'm going to try and find the school buildings first, which are somewhere nearby. This will be a very old track. It shows on maps going back to early 1800s, and I'm sure it went back beyond that. I guess it was a shortcut to the church for the villagers. Whilst we're wandering up towards the school and the church, just a quick mention of the real deep history of Elton village as a sort of continuous settlement, because there's always sort of traces back to Romans and Iron Age and Bronze Age and even beyond in most of the villages that surround Peterborough. In terms of it being a continuous settlement, Elton can be traced back to the 2nd century, so true Anglo-Saxon agricultural settlement. It changed its name many times over the centuries to what it is today. I'll put all those names up on the screen so you can see how it's moved to eventually reach Elton, which was relatively recently. Population 150 around about the time of the Domesday Book. Went up to a peak of about 1,000 in the late 1800s, and it's around about 700-800 now, I think, from what I read somewhere. I think 730 rings a bell. I think that was the last time they measured it in 2008. So it sort of goes up and down, but it's an agricultural settlement and goes back a very long way, but true Anglo-Saxon. The school buildings are over there on the left. We'll get a bit closer in a mo. I hope I've timed it reasonably well, or fortunately, with this walk, because it's half term and the kids shouldn't be in school, otherwise it would be difficult to film it. oldest part of the school is the low section with the 3 windows in the middle, which was, I think it was a boys' school in 1727. So if you imagine that on its own, that was the small school that started it all off. And then it got extended in 1876 to what you see today. It does actually have an 1876 stamp at the top, so I got that one right. I'm going to turn around a minute to get you a view that many people would probably recognise better than what I've just shown you. This will be the more familiar route up from the village to the school that I'm sure many people will recognise if you've been here or brought your kids here. And as I say, the low section in the middle with the 3 windows was the original 1727 boys' school, and the extensions either side dated to 1876 when it was a mixed school, and in 1962 it became an infant school, which is what it is today, or primary school as we should call it. Lovely building. Right, just coming up to All Saints Church of Elton. Not the oldest of churches, it goes back to the 13th century, about 1270. But there was an older Anglo-Saxon church underneath it. They found the foundations of it under one of the walls, so they know it's there. But there's hardly anything left, or there's nothing within the church that I know of that is a survivor from the early church. There's a couple of Anglo-Saxon crosses that used to be outside but are now inside. I doubt we're going to be able to get in, but if we can, we might find those. It's an impressive tower. Dates to 1500. I think I read it was rebuilt in 1500, which means maybe one assumes there was an earlier tower of an earlier date, but I doubt it was as big and as grand as this mighty beast. Very impressive. A lot of very old gravestones. Not many of them are legible. I'm sure we'll find one somewhere. That's a familiar name. And Elizabeth, wife of Robert Hayton. Can't really see the date. Died 1890, I believe that says. I think Robert died 1902, 1903. That's a big name in Elton. I think it's pronounced the Haytons. We'll come across this a bit later on, but yeah, the Hayton family were the people who kicked off the Vinco cycle works, which became quite a legend within Elton and spread nationwide from here. Very early producers of bicycles and motorbikes, and then later on switched to motor cars when motor cars first came on scene, and Heighton's garage in Elton will be familiar to a lot of people. And I'm pretty sure Robert Heighton was the guy who kicked it all off, but I'll have to check that one out. Sorry, because I don't want to get that one wrong. But we'll have a look, and I'll confirm at the bottom of the screen if I'm right or if I'm wrong. I'll put myself right. There's a survivor. I think it says Thomas Beale, who died 1880 something, aged 69 years. There's a big bold in-your-face stone made to survive, Ebenezer James Kirkby, who died 1883, aged, let's say 17 years. That's no age. I think that's what it says, you can't really read it. Also Berta Kirkby, who died 1883, aged 3 years. Infant death. This was often the case back then, sadly. I'll see if I can find something out. This seems to be the Kirkby plot. The two graves either side of that one are also from the Kirkby family, to whom these must have been two of their children. It's usually the arches in these doorways that are the oldest parts of these churches, so I suspect that arch at the back surrounding the door is probably 13th century, and the church is open according to the sign, so we could be in luck. That's a wonderfully old door as well. That's got some age to it. But yeah, that arch is probably 13th century. Let's take a look. The font, or at least the top of the font, is definitely 1300s. It's old. The base is more recent. I find these, that looks like one of the crosses, if not both the crosses, of Anglo-Saxon age. Which it is, or at least that bottom that bottom piece is definitely Anglo-Saxon. Not quite sure what I'm looking at in the terms of the pieces there, whether it's the cross off the top of it, I don't know. I did shoot a wedding here once, but I can't really remember too much about it. I also photographed a christening here, which I vaguely remember. Nice church. That wasn't the Anglo-Saxon crosses, I was wrong because they're over here. I thought they were still standing as opposed to lying flat out. And they have pride of place, as they deserve to have, really. Thought to date to around about between 900 and 1000. I'm not sure how they worked that out, but definitely Anglo-Saxon. Some serious age there, with classic Anglo-Saxon decoration that you can see better at the bottom of the right hand one. They originally used to sit side by side outside the church, so they predate this church by some 200 to 300 years, so were clearly around at the time of the original church here. Tremendous amount of work goes into producing these, or went into producing these stained glass windows. I mean, it's just phenomenal detail. Contains the names, bottom right, the Earl of Carrisfort, which was a title given to members of the Proby family, and the Proby family have held the manor here since the 1600s. It's probably they who donated or paid for the window, I'm only guessing. The Proby name is going to appear, well, it does appear a lot throughout the church, but it's the big name in Elton. It's the manor holders for a very long time, 400 years-ish. Not sure the story behind that one, in memory of Edward Newman of Barnsley, 1893. Must be a story behind that one. Born 1868, died 1893, so that's only 25 years of age. But important enough to get a window. Going back to these bits and pieces, it says on the wall that they were discovered during the restoration of the chancel in 1905, so it doesn't really say what they are. Apart from that is undoubtedly the shaft of a cross at the bottom, and I suspect some of the bits above are from whatever was the base of that cross or was on the top of the cross, but it doesn't say exactly what the cross is, but it looks Anglo-Saxon to me. May not be, it's certainly old. Possibly dating back to the original church. Okay, well, it's good to get inside. I always think churches should be open, but I understand why some are not. Really impressed by this door. I mean, I'm tempted to say that dates back to the beginnings of the church, 1270. But I don't know. It's certainly very, very, very old. Great strapping chunks of ironwork on it. Very impressive. Right, back into the sunshine. On the left up ahead is the War Memorial, erected in July 1921, and it's made out of Cornish granite, no less, so that is going to survive. To the glory of God and in proud and grateful memory of the men of Elton who fell in the Great War, 1914 to 1918. and just the one villager, the one brave man who lost his life from the village during the Second World War, Edward Meadwell. The death came in the Aegean Sea. It was either in the Merchant Navy or the Royal Navy. May they rest in peace. Right, before we head out on Overend, just looking across the road, is the old iron foundry, set up in the mid-1800s by James Hayes. And James had a couple of claims to fame really with his foundry. One is that he was the discoverer of, or the inventor of, the straw elevator, which I'll put a picture up from what I think was sort of the original patent for it. And they're still made today, albeit not here. The other claim to fame was that Henry Royce, the one half of Rolls-Royce, tried to get a job here, and James said no. He said, "I'm not taking you on, you're not strong enough." So, not much of a claim to fame. Infamous claim there, I suppose. And that is James's house on the right, the sort of castellated house, which is rather nice. Let's see if I can get down the side of that building, which is of at least industrial interest. Back with the good old cars. Let's have a quick look down here before somebody chases me off. These would have been the foundry buildings. Very nice. Big arch there. Ghost arch. Still looks quite industrial now. Ghost door. Ghost window. Very good. Lovely. James Hayes' iron foundry. Mid-1800s. Almost looks relatively untouched. It doesn't look like it's a house as such. We will see this on a drive through and think, what on earth is that? It was actually set up originally on Rectory Farm, which is just down the road from here, sort of slightly into the village, which we'll see in part 2. And it was set up as a tribute to that young lady. And it was a kind of family memorial really, and nothing more than that, but it was, because of the timing, 1917, and towards the back end of the Great War, it became doubled up as a war memorial. The people who created this memorial for Jocelyn wanted it to be more broadly a memorial for the village, people who died in the Great War, so it's become a sort of war memorial now as well as a personal memorial. Unusual thing. Jocelyn was a member of the Proby family, the manor holders. Right, you all know the building coming up on the right. Which is the Black Horse. One of two village pubs. The other one being the Crown, which we'll see in part 2. Dates back, it's one of the oldest buildings actually in the village. Dates back to the early 1600s. Although it was all refronted with modern stone, or relatively modern stone compared with the 1600s. If I can cross the road. There's a little plaque on the bottom here, which is an Ordnance Survey sort of benchmark type plaque. I've not seen one of these before. There are people that spend their lives tracking these down. 1942 Ordnance Survey BM benchmark. Yeah, that's the first. Never seen one of them before. Early 1800s building there, house on the right, shop on the left. As if you needed telling, it still looks like a shop on the left. Known by villagers in the 1950s as the Top Shop. One of many sort of general stores in the village. Another old one coming up, aren't they all? Late 1600s. Could do the new thatch by the looks of it. Helps to give it an aged appearance, I guess. Not that I know anything about thatches. Certainly an old building, late 1600s, as I say. These are quite interesting on the left here. I'm going to cross the road and shoot this because it's hard with the sun. Where those two bungalows sit now, that used to be a set of almshouses. Known as Cooper's Hospital. They often used to call almshouses hospitals. They're not hospitals as we know them today. But yeah, Cooper's almshouses. I know I've got photographs of them somewhere. But they sat over there, where exactly on the site where those two bungalows sit. Set up by and paid for by Reverend John Cooper. There was a vicar here in the early 1600s, and the almshouse is dated, I think, mid to late 1600s. The wall is still the original, and the gateway still the original. And you can see at the back it says Cooper's Hospital. Coming up to a rather infamous landmark in Elton, if I can call it that, this boarded up cottage. Dates back to the 1700s. It's been boarded up for about 35 years now. Nobody seems to know what's going to be done with it. It's owned by the Elton estates and it's just being left derelict, really. And it's been like this, as I say, for 35 years since the last tenant left. And it used to be a carpenter's base, a carpenter's house, and used to have a busy yard round the back where he used to do his work. I'll pop round there in a minute and see if there's anything still to see. It seems amazing that it just sits there, nobody does anything about it. Completely untouched since the last tenant moved out. The carpenter's yard with workshop still standing. A nice old 1600s farmhouse in there behind the trees. Farm buildings around the back. Just coming down to the main entrance to Elton Hall, which we will not be covering in any great detail as it's a video in its own right. Built in the 1400s. It's a long time ago, and it's a lot bigger than that. And hope to visit this year actually and give it a good look without a camera, but just to visit. Tour around inside and outside, nice gardens and all that. But yeah, that's all you can see from the road. 1400s, and it's belonged to the Proby family since the 1660s, if I recall. We'll head on to what the villagers used to know as Botolph Green, which obviously has another meaning to those from different parts of Peterborough. St Botolph Green, as it's known now. Not a lot to see down here, really. They're mostly 1600s cottages. I was about to say nothing special, but the 1600s cottage is pretty special, really, in fairness. Used to be some good conker trees down here, I don't know if there still are. But yeah, they're just classic 1600s cottages like this one. Nice place to live. A lot of the cottages, particularly on the back side of Botolph Green, are well hidden back from the road, so you don't really get to see them. That's a nice one. I mean, they're nearly 400 years old, which is pretty impressive. Still looking good. That's a belter. Your own stream running through the front garden. Very idyllic. This one at the end here used to be a gamekeeper's cottage. Dating to the late 1600s, and it's grade 2 listed. Just coming up towards the end of Overend, now where it meets the busy A605 as it now is. Just wanted to see where the old A605 Oundle Road used to go, which is where this wall is on the right. Used to swing around on a very sharp bend, which I'm old enough to remember. Put up a brief snippet from a 1981 video. It's a bit scratchy, but it shows you what it used to look like. Where that road used to swing round. This is it. This is as far as it goes now, up until these two cars, then it disappears into the woods. You can see the old road surface. Now a ghost road. Right, heading up, back up Overend now, back to the church, where we will turn the other way to get the other end of Overend. If anyone knows why Overend, well, two things. First of all, why is it called Overend? And secondly, why is it Overend one word now when it used to be Overend two words up to the 1950s or so? Just curiosity, really. The house on the left there, which is two houses now, used to be one big farmhouse, late 1600s, early 1700s. The house with the distinctive green doors was a house, the tall one with the three dormer windows. On the left was a bakery. It was Butlers Bakery, which I think was still going quite late, I think into the 1950s, I think it was. Certainly well into the 1900s. But yeah, the one on the left was the bakery shop. Should pop up a photo in a second of Butlers. Cute. The two big, relatively modern builds there sit on the site of what would be familiar 50 years ago, 60 years ago to people who travelled this road. It'd be familiar as Heighton's Garage, and I think it was set up in the 1920s, I think 1924. By the Mr. Heighton that ran the Vinco cycling works just around the corner from here. Moved on to cars, set up the garage, and it was still here. I don't actually know when Heighton's Garage disappeared. I could find an advert for it in 1987, so it was certainly going for quite a long time. And a lot of people will remember a guy called Edgar Eddis, who passed away in 1997, and he was very much the manager of Heighton's Garage for his last couple of decades plus, and a lot of people will be familiar and will remember Edgar very popular character. The building that they based the garage around was an old RAF Wittering building, which they must have dismantled, brought it over here and built it on the forecourt as their base. And that would have been in the 1920s as well, so an early RAF building as well. Some of you may remember Highton Garage franchise, which was the same Highton's in Thrapston, in Stamford, and even in Peterborough. Very successful business. There's an old milestone there. That will probably go back to, I don't know, 1700s, 1800s, as they all do. 8 miles to Peterborough. There's usually something on the other side. That's actually on this side. I think it says 5 miles to Oundle. There's a bus stop on the left here, which I drove past the other day and looked at it and I thought, yeah, okay, it's a bus stop, but it looks old. It actually is, it's nearly 100 years old. It dates back to 1930. It was built to shelter villagers waiting for the bus to Peterborough. A bus shelter with a bit of character, that one, and a bit of age. Yeah, very nice bus stop, bus shelter should I say. Right, I'll let you lot guess at what this building coming up might just be, and there will be a clue. It's a smithy, late 1700s, was still going in the 1970s. That still looks like a smithy. It was bought quite recently and the chap was planning to open it as something, and was very aware that it was a smithy and wanted to sort of keep the character of it, but I don't know where it's going anymore. But yeah, it was the smithy, very well known to villagers. I'm told all the gear inside has gone, sadly. Still got the chimney. Right next to it is what is now the village hall, Highgate Hall. This building has a bit of background to it as well, which I'll cover in a mo. The hall was enlarged by Richard George Proby. Another plaque, I do love these plaques. Saves me having to do research. Hall was presented to the village of Elton by Granville Proby in memory of his father Douglas James on the occasion of the Silver Jubilee of His Majesty the King, George V. Got to look that date up. From what I've been able to dig up, the hall was originally an implement shed owned by James Hayes, the iron foundry guy. It was a sort of open-sided, presumably not this side but the other side, where he used to keep a lot of his tools of his trade. That's how it sort of started out. But then Mr. Hayton of Vinco Cycles and eventually Hayton's Garage, he took it over and used it as a sort of leisure venue for the 40 to 50 employees who worked at his Vinco Cycle Works just down in the village. So he used it for the families as a bit of a leisure facility for them. Round the back, if you are of a certain age, and there's nothing to see round there now, it used to be a youth centre, youth club, call it what you wish. In the I think it was mid to late 1900s, probably more mid than late. And they used an old Nissan hut from Alconbury Airfield as their base, which is why it's no longer there. It would have been wooden. So there's a bit of history on this plot. Right, time to go and get your brew on. That is the end of Elton Part 1. Oh, and don't forget to tune into Part 2.